Okay. Check 1 2, check 1 2. I hope I don't blow the mic out on this episode. Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice. What You Reading For, number 17. The YouTube live stream series where I talk about books that I've read and you listen for the most part. This is, it's like almost too short to even call a book. This is another one like, what's it called? The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, where it's like, I think it's like 120 pages or something like that. Somewhere in that realm. I got this copy from AK Press, which is a like online distributor of various political kind of political, what would you call it, literature, I guess you could say. Check out AK Press. Awesome place. They do awesome business, and they sorry, 1 second. Okay, there we go. They took my order and packaged it and shipped it really quickly. I think I got the book in like 4 days or something like that. Very, very awesome. So, yeah, this is largely a book that is, it was written in the 1930s, I believe, maybe the 1940s, but some, in the sort of early to mid 20th century. I don't know why. Hopefully everything's okay. OBS just kind of gives me warnings every now and again, like, hey, your bit rate is dropping catastrophically. But I don't really know how to fix it. So hopefully you guys can still see me and hear me. So this was a book that was written in the early to mid 20th century that was meant as a primer and a kind of a synopsis, I guess you could say, of anarchism and specifically anarcho-syndicalist thought kind of leading up to the time that it was written. And I think largely it was intended to be written, or it was intended to be read by people at the time who were not already anarchists or leftists. It was meant to be read by people who could maybe be persuaded, maybe they're labor unionists, or they are, people that are, participating in an organization of some kind that, could be someone who would be persuaded by Rudolf Rocker's arguments. So the book has a lot of history, more history than I thought it would. It's less a thorough kind of explanation as to how anarchist syndicalism would work. But I think that, I think thinking about it sometimes in that way is a fool's errand. Because, at the end of the day, when you're thinking and talking about anarchism, about anarchy, you're talking about something that, like, it would be and would exist in a time so radically different than the one that we have now, that to speculate what it would look like, what it would be like. I keep blowing out the microphone, and I'm really trying to not do that. In order to envision that, like, it would really require somebody being from the time that is in question. What's the point I'm trying to get at here? I guess the point really is that, like, I expected this book to explain to me how anarcho-syndicalism would work, and after reading it, I think that that was a mistake for me to expect it to do that. A large majority of the book is taken up and concerned with explaining the history of socialism and the history of, the First International and sort of, working conditions in 18th and 19th century England, and sort of the genesis of capitalism, sort of the transitioning from, Enlightenment era kind of liberalism to industrialization era socialist thought. Some of you who watch this show and don't know anything about leftism or anarchism might be very confused, and I don't blame you, to be honest. It's very kind of heady and boring. A lot of it is. This was a book that was recommended to me by a friend who said that it is a good introductory text for people who don't know a lot about anarchism. And I, without going into my personal politics at all, I would say I am among the number of people in this world who probably do kind of understand a little bit about anarchism. I find that with political theory and stuff, I find that I learn more and more every day. I wouldn't claim to be an expert of any kind in that area. But do I think this is a book that is good at introducing the ideas of anarchism to a beginner, and especially in the 21st century? No, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case at all. And once again, this is something that's pretty, it's fairly obvious to people who have read about this stuff before and are kind of familiar with the subject matter, but that anarchism isn't really it's not a system of government, because of course it's not. Anarchism has to exist without a government. And so, when people ask about anarchism, well, how would this work and how would that work? And those are fair questions to ask. But someone who has studied this for a while, it's kind of, it's almost like, I'm going to make this comparison. Anarchists almost they beg the question of what if we built a really awesome spaceship and we sailed off into space and found a really picturesque kind of idyllic planet, and then we all lived in harmony forever. And then people who are skeptical, fairly so, would come along and ask questions like, well, how would we build the engines, and what would the sensor array look like, and all these kinds of different specific mechanical questions about the thing. And then but it's, at the end of the day, it's well, really all I'm saying is that it would be nice if that happened, right? It would be a good and preferable thing to what we have now, right? This is the argument that anarchists would make, and this is really, really simplifying it and boiling it down, because you look at kind of various forms of government, plutarchy and oligarchy and, all these different kinds of government, right? Monarchy. And anarchy is no narky, if that makes sense. Like, it's no government, it's no state. It's asking the question: is it possible for humans to exist in a world where we all are able to not necessarily get along, because I think that is kind of simplifying it, and it's also, I don't think, an attainable goal. I think there will always be conflict among humans as we exist right now. The human form and human ideology and all these different things that influence the way people are, it probably would, I don't think that conflict is unavoidable. So it's not necessarily asking everybody to get along. It's more just asking, are we able to all kind of survive and make space for each other in the absence of a centralized kind of body of government, of state, which is an interesting question to ask, and one question that I think should be asked. Again, I'm trying to not go into my politics and my beliefs about all of this, but I think that asking the question at least is very worthwhile. And so, when people hear about anarchy and like, oh, you're an anarchist, like like you think that there shouldn't be a government or whatever, it does, it can, and I'm sure it can feel naive to have those questions asked of you. And so books like these, where, what you want out of this is an instruction manual, a definitive guide of like, here's how you not only bring anarchy about, but how it works once you get there. But such a thing just does not exist. The type of world that would bring about and would exist after anarchy is so radically different than the one we live in now that it's impossible to imagine what it would look like and how it would work. It's up to the humans of the future to create that world. If we truly want to live in a world that is free of state coercion and capitalistic exploitation and all these things, it's going to take a lot of action on the parts of a lot of people. And so it's kind of impossible, standing in the 21st century as it is right now. It's impossible to really say what that's going to look like or what it's going to be like. So as it stands as a historical text, Rudolf Rocker's Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice, I think is a pretty good one in terms of, again, explaining kind of the origins of this thought and explaining how, labor conditions in England were such that sort of labor unions and the unionization of labor took place. And, the government tried to fight against it, right? There was lots of pushback against that because, well, it was clear to the owning class, the people who owned the stuff, that people were unhappy with the arrangement and that they were willing to band together in order to do something about it, right? And then you have, kind of coming out of that, you have, Marxist thought, thinkers from places like Germany, other countries that are also industrializing, right? You have French thinkers and people that are kind of putting forward ideas about the relationship between capital and labor, and the relationship between the state and capital, and the state and labor. That largely the state is the one kind of defending capital against labor when labor tries to take things into their own hands. And so, as you kind of get this thought coming from the young Hegelians and like all of these different leftist and socialist thinkers, you have a labor movement rising up in like the United States. You have the American Railway Union, all these different things. Laborers clashing with those who pay them for their labor, pay them a pittance, really. So during industrialization, basically, like, people were being exploited to such a degree that like they were stacked in these awful tenements in New York City, people, disease just spreading rampantly, alcoholism spreading rampantly, people's bodies falling apart because of how hard they were worked and how little they were paid, that it became clear that something had to be done. That the modern of the time labor market was not much different than serfdom or peasantry. People were being massively exploited. And this is post-slavery, of course. So slavery had, or at least some of it was, kind of depends on the area and the time that you're talking about. But like large portions of this kind of took place after slavery had already been abolished in the United States. Rudolf Rocker himself was German. I think he did a lot of his writing in England, though, if I remember the history of it correctly. But I'm relating a lot of it, I think, to United States labor history, because that's just what's the clearest to me. But you have sort of this labor movement being birthed, and then you have I'm trying to think of where the first kind of genesis of this would be. The first thing that springs to mind is that there, as the Bolshevik Revolution takes place in Russia and later then the Soviet Union, you have some conflict that results basically in a lot of anarchists being killed. And, anarchist thought had already kind of like started to evolve at that point. And you have people like Emma Goldman fleeing the Soviet Union, basically saying that, like, initially I was in support of this labor movement, labor revolution, socialist revolution, but then found that the dictatorship of the proletariat, as it was called, was just as cruel to those who sought to abolish the state. Which, if you are, according to kind of communist dogma, that's part of the deal. Communism is largely described as being stateless. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is sort of supposed to, in Marxist thought, kind of be the transitional state between capitalism and socialism/communism. There's supposed to be an intermediary state where the proletariat controls the state and the state controls the means of production. Well, a lot of anarchists weren't very happy with this because they were kind of like, well, that just sort of sounds like it kind of still sounds like capitalism a little bit, because we're not really being able to control the means of our production. So what's going on? And my understanding is that Lenin and those after him just basically killed a lot of them for kind of raising those questions. And then I guess the next big thing is the Spanish Civil War. I'm not mistaken. Basically, that like Franco, I can't remember his full name, but Franco is this dictator that comes to power in Spain, is deposed. You have a few years in Spain, or in parts of Spain, in Catalonia, I believe is the area that it predominantly centers around, where anarchists are in power, or quote unquote in power. Really, the ideal state of the anarchist is one in which the commoner, the people on the street, nobody stands above another, and everyone works together. Nobody goes hungry. Nobody goes without a roof over their head. And in general, people live in harmony. And out of this, my understanding is that they're able to rapidly mobilize a war machine in order to fight the fascists in that were in Spain, and were also I believe were coming to power in Italy as well. And they're able to, through no centralized state, and basically just through the syndicalism, the syndication of all these various labor unions and farm worker unions and stuff like that, able to coordinate the production and arming and training of a fighting force that is capable of like defending themselves against the fascists. Again, my history on this place and time is very murky. I have 2 books that are on the reading list that I will cover on this show at some point. One is called Sons of Night, I believe, which is a history of the Spanish Civil War. And then No Pasarán, which is Matt Christman's book on the Spanish Civil War. Because it's a period of time and a period of history that I think is fascinating to no end. And it really kind of is the template example of, again, going back to the beginning of this rant, when people ask, well, how would it work exactly? How would anarchism work? Like revolutionary Catalonia. I think most anarchists would point to that and say, that is the type of society that I would wish to exist in. Now, obviously, without having to create weaponry and the machines of war with which to fight fascism. That would be nice if we didn't have to do that too. But certainly they were able to do it in an egalitarian, equal, free way. So tracing that kind of arc, the arc of history from industrializing England all the way to kind of like the Spanish Civil War, and then kind of gearing up to World War II, is the sort of time frame that's discussed in this book. And a large portion of this book also is talking about criticisms of liberalism and criticizing liberalism for not really doing what it claims that it does, and also not being very effective at fighting fascism. Those are some of the criticisms that Rudolf Rocker levies at liberalism. Probably the main, and if there was any kind of, let me see if I can find the exact quote. I'm going to put the mic down for just a second. Okay. All right, one sec. Okay. I think this is the section that I want to read. This to me was the critical bit of the book that not only kind of lays things out pretty clearly, fairly clearly, but it's probably the part that will stick with me the longest in terms of when I think about this book, what I will remember from the messages that it gives. Let me read a little bit here. This is page 10. Liberalism and democracy were preeminently political concepts, and since the great majority of the original adherents of both maintained the right of ownership in the old sense, these had to renounce them both when economic development took a course which could not be practically reconciled with the original principles of democracy, and still less with those of liberalism. Democracy, with its motto of equality of all citizens before the law, and liberalism with its right of man over his own person, both shipwrecked on the realities of the capitalist economic form. So long as millions of human beings in every country had to sell their labor power to a small minority of owners, and to sink into the most wretched misery if they could find no buyers, the so-called equality before the law remains merely a pious fraud, since the laws are made by those who find themselves in possession of the social wealth. But in the same way, there can also be no talk of a right over one's own person, for that right ends when one is compelled to submit to the economic dictation of another if he does not want to starve. Anarchism has in common with liberalism the idea that the happiness and prosperity of the individual must be the standard in all social matters. And in common with the great representatives of liberal thought, it has also the idea of limiting the functions of government to a minimum. Its supporters have followed this thought to its ultimate logical consequences and wish to eliminate every institution of political power from the life of society. When Jefferson clothes the basic concept of liberalism in the words, "that government is best which governs least," then anarchists say with Thoreau that government is best which government governs not at all. In common with the founders of socialism, anarchists demand the abolition of all economic monopolies and the common ownership of the soil and all other means of production, the use of which must be available to all without distinction, for personal and social freedom is conceivable only on the basis of equal economic advantages for everybody. Within the socialist movement itself, the anarchist represents the viewpoint that the war against capitalism must be at the same time a war against all institutions of political power. For in history, economic exploitation has always gone hand in hand with political and social oppression. The exploitation of man by man and the dominion of man over man are inseparable, and each is the condition of the other. So, again, this is Rudolf Rocker basically saying these are the sort of, comparing and contrasting anarchism with democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And maybe the most salient and most poignant criticism of liberalism that I have ever been exposed to, which is basically that, and we're talking about capital L liberalism, right? We're not talking about American Democrat liberalism. We're talking about the 18th century ideal of the Enlightenment era of liberalism, of liberty, humans being free from the constraints of absolutist monarchy, right? And, one of the key tenets of liberalism, one of the key promises, basically, of liberalism is that, men, capital M, men, meaning humans, need to have absolute and total control over their own body and their own will, right? That is necessary for freedom. Well, I think a lot of people, most sane people, I think, would think that's a good thing and would agree that it's necessary. But anarchists would ask the question, basically, if somebody can compel me to work for them because if I don't, I will starve, is that really the freedom of my body? Is that really the freedom of my will? It doesn't really feel like it. It does, and in practice, it doesn't really result in that. If someone can come to me and basically say, you can work for one of these 5 companies, wherever you're born, where you're born in a place, and in that place there's only 5 jobs you could realistically do, even if you get education or whatever. There's 5 jobs. This is this is simplifying it, but I'm trying to illustrate why it's a problem. You can work for one of these 5 places. Well, me as a person, what if I don't want to do any of those things? What if I want to do some other 6th thing? Or what if the companies themselves are not exactly what I would consider? What if it's a company that makes bombs, or whatever? There's any number of reasons. Or what if I have a disability? I'm missing a foot or something. Whatever the case is, that I can't work for these companies. My freedom then is limited to you can choose to starve, I suppose. For whatever reason, they have made it such that somebody has locked all the food and the water and the safety, the shelter, the clothing, everything behind a set of doors, and to open those doors, you have to go work for somebody. That's not really freedom. That's not really, and again, people would argue, well, you have, of course, the choice of where you work. You have the choice, you could always go do X, Y, and Z. But when faced with the reality of capitalism, I think most people would agree that, no, you kind of have to choose somebody to do labor for, Of course, some people start their own businesses. They do their kind of entrepreneur type stuff, and that's great. But like 99% of those businesses fail, and so the kind of myth of the American dream is kind of just that. That if you want to survive, you're probably going to have to do labor for somebody else, almost certainly. And so liberalism kind of eats itself almost, because liberalism is what has allowed people to be like, yeah, you can start up this business even if you're chewing up all the local natural resources and you're polluting the environment and all this different types of stuff. You're exploiting the labor pool of the nearby, where you live. That's fine, because it's liberalism, baby. Like we can do whatever we want. We're free. Well, all the people that then have to go work for you, where's their freedom? Where's their liberalism? It becomes this self-defeating ideology, and anarchism, I think, just outrightly rejects that. So there's that. That's probably the key takeaway, I would say. Do I want to say anything else about this? It was good. It was good. I think it's, I don't think that I would give this to a beginner of anarchist thought. I would give this to somebody who already kind of is familiar with the arguments and is a little bit more interested in the history of anarcho-syndicalist thought. But it does have some good arguments, and I don't think that it's completely it's completely worthless with regards to that. I think that's probably all I want to say. Let's go ahead and take a look and see. I don't think I saw anybody in the chat. So I think we're good when it comes to that. Yeah, we should be good. Okay. So what's up next? Up next is This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, I believe. Actually, I'm going to give you guys the rundown right now of what's coming up next for What You Reading For. So we did this, and then we have This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. There by Tommy Orange is after that. I just finished that night before last. Then we have Where Men Win Glory by John Krakauer. Just started that basically right after I finished There. I usually try to stay away from saying if I like it or not before doing the episode. When I'm doing these little, here's what we're reading next, I try to stay away from saying if I like it or not, but I can't stop myself. Where Men Win Glory is a phenomenal book, and you should read it. Regardless of what kinds of books you read, you should just check it out. After Where Men Win Glory, we are finally tackling The Way of Kings, Brando Sando. I think that sometime in December, I will start The Way of Kings, and I would imagine that it will take me most of December and January to finish that book, maybe even longer, unless I just really blow through it. I don't really know. But yeah, people, that's the order of the books. Please read along. Make sure to join the live chats and to leave comments afterwards. If you like this video, please make sure to like it. Please make sure to comment. Let me know what you think of Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice by Rudolf Rocker. Make sure to subscribe so that you get notified when I go live. And I believe that's it, everybody. I will see you next time.